She disappeared in Alabama. Then, more than 2,000 miles away, her body turned up in a California ravine. That is the kind of distance that changes a case instantly. A missing person is one thing. A woman found dead across the country is something else entirely. Because the moment those 2 points exist on the same map, the question stops being only what happened to her, and becomes who had the power to move her that far. That is what makes this case feel so cold from the very beginning. Not just the death, but the impossible geography of it. Her name was Victoria Hicks Hargrove. She was 29 years old, from Opelika, Alabama, and she disappeared in late January 1980. At the time, no one in California knew her name, and no one in Alabama knew that the answer to her disappearance had already ended up on the other side of the country. When tourists looked over a guardrail on Highway 74 in California's Coachella Valley on February 18, 1980, they saw a woman's body about 20 feet down in a ravine. She had no identification on her, and investigators could not match her to any local missing person reports. That is where the case split in two. In Alabama, she was a missing woman. In California, she was a Jane Doe. And for more than 40 years, those two stories stayed separated by distance, silence, and the limits of the era. That is one of the most haunting forms a cold case can take. Not a murder with no body, not a body with no story, but a body and a story that belong together and somehow never meet. Because in 1980, investigators did what they could. Fingerprints were taken, dental records were collected, an autopsy was performed, but the autopsy could not determine a conclusive cause of death, and authorities reportedly found no obvious fatal trauma like gunshot or knife wounds. Without identification, without a clear cause of death, and without any local missing person report that fit, the case hardened into one of the most frustrating shapes possible. A dead woman with no name and no clear explanation for how she got there. That alone would be disturbing enough, but the Alabama side of the story makes it worse. Because Victoria did not vanish from some anonymous roadside world, she vanished from a real life. She worked at local newspapers in Alabama, including the Auburn Bulletin. She had an apartment in Opelika. She existed inside a known social world, a place where people could notice when she was gone. And yet, even with all of that, the distance between Alabama and California proved stronger than the systems meant to connect them. Riverside County detectives had a body, Opelika had a disappearance, but those facts remained strangers to each other for decades. That is what makes the opening of this case feel so eerie, not because the evidence is dramatic, because it is quiet. A woman disappears. A woman is found. The body is neatly dressed in a velour blouse, trousers, and tan sandals. There is no identification, no immediate answer, no obvious local connection, just a ravine, a guardrail, and a dead woman whose life has somehow been severed from her name. And when a case opens like that, the imagination goes dark fast. How does a 29-year-old Alabama woman end up dead in Southern California? Did she travel willingly? Did she know the person she was with? Was she already dead before she crossed state lines? Or was she taken alive and moved? Did someone lure her west? Or did her disappearance begin as something smaller and become something much worse? These are the questions that turn a cold case from sad into haunting. Because distance suggests control, it suggests planning, or at the very least a sequence of events big enough that chance alone stops feeling satisfying as an explanation. A body found 2,000 miles from home does not just imply death, it implies a journey the victim did not finish telling. And then there is the timing. Victoria disappeared in late January 1980. Her body was found in California in mid-February. That means whatever happened to her unfolded inside a narrow, awful window, long enough for fear to build, short enough that every lost day mattered. The gap between her disappearance and the discovery of her body is the kind of space investigators would later want to rebuild, minute by minute, stop by stop, person by person. But because the case fractured into two jurisdictions and one unidentified body, those first critical weeks were never given the unified shape they needed. By the time science could reconnect the story, The trail itself was decades old. There is another detail that makes this case feel even stranger. Around the same time Victoria disappeared from Opelika, an editor from the same newspaper also went missing for a period, before quietly returning later. Authorities have not established any official connection between the two disappearances, and investigators have said they cannot comment further on that at this time. But the mere existence of that overlap gives the case an added layer of discomfort, because once two disappearances begin hovering around the same small orbit, the imagination naturally starts asking whether coincidence is doing too much work. At first, the California file had the body but not the woman. That is one of the coldest shapes a case can take, because once a body has no name, investigators lose more than identity, they lose context. Who should be grieving? Who should be questioned? What habits mattered? What fears existed before the death? What relationship, job, trip, phone call, argument, or plan might explain why this woman was on that road at all? Without a name, the body becomes evidence before it can remain fully human. And in Victoria's case, that namelessness lasted more than 40 years. The woman found on February 18, 1980, gave authorities pieces, but not enough to build a whole story. Fingerprints and dental information were preserved. The autopsy created a record. Her clothing, her estimated age, her physical description, all of it survived. But because authorities could not conclusively determine how she died, every later question became harder. Was she killed elsewhere and dumped there? Did she die during travel? Was she assaulted in a way that did not leave obvious external injury? Was there poisoning, suffocation, restraint, or another cause that science in 1980 could not confidently detect or prove? The body was there, but the story was still out of reach. And then there was the problem of geography. A body in California means one thing if the victim is local. It means something much darker if she is not. At the time, Riverside County investigators checked what they could, but no local missing person case matched her. That left open the possibility that the answer lived somewhere else entirely. And when the answer to a California death actually begins in Alabama, the case is not just difficult, it is fractured. The agencies most capable of solving the death are separated by distance, by record systems that did not communicate well enough in 1980, and by the simple fact that no one on one side knew what the other side was holding. That is why Jane Doe cases are so devastating. They are not only mysteries about death, they are failures of connection. Somewhere, people are missing someone. Somewhere else, investigators are standing over the body of that same person. And the country between those 2 points becomes part of the crime. Victoria's case embodied that perfectly. In Alabama, she had a life real enough that her disappearance mattered. In California, her body existed real enough that her death mattered. But because those two realities never locked together, the case was forced into a long, unnatural separation. She was not fully missing anymore, and not fully found either. She existed in the worst possible middle ground. That middle ground lasted for decades, and the longer it lasted, the more the case risked becoming one of those files people quietly accept as permanent. Riverside County kept the records. The fingerprints existed, the autopsy existed, her clothing and case details existed. But without a match, the file could only circle the same blank center. Who was she? Where had she come from? Why was she there? If the body belongs to no known local woman, then who crossed that much distance to leave her there? And how did they believe they could get away with it? That is where the case starts becoming more than a Jane Doe story. It becomes a transportation mystery. And transportation mysteries are always chilling because they imply more than chance. A woman from Alabama does not simply drift dead into a Southern California ravine by accident. Whether she traveled willingly at first or not, whether she knew the person with her or not, whether the westward movement began normally or turned criminal later, the end result still carries the same implication. Someone had control over the circumstances long enough for her to end up 2,000 miles from home and nameless when she was found. The years did what years always do in cases like this. They changed the outside faster than the center. On the outside, life kept moving. Calendars turned, headlines faded. People in Alabama got older. People in California moved on to newer cases. A disappearance from 1980 and a Jane Doe discovered in 1980 became, over time, two old files in two different systems. But at the center, the wrongness of the case never really softened. It remained a woman from one state, ending up dead in another, with no explanation strong enough to satisfy what the map itself was already saying. That is what makes long unidentified cases feel so haunting. Not because they are unsolved in the usual way, because they are unfinished in two different directions at once. Who was she? And what happened to her? Most murder cases at least get to ask the second question first. Victoria's case could not. For decades, it had to stay trapped inside the first one, and that delay may have protected the truth more than anything else, because once a victim remains unnamed long enough, the people connected to her disappearance begin disappearing too, not always physically, socially, historically. The world forgets how to place them. A missing woman from Alabama in 1980 becomes harder to hold in focus with each passing year. Meanwhile, the unidentified body in California becomes just one more old file in a county system full of old files. Both sides become easier to neglect because neither side feels complete. That is how someone can vanish across America and nearly stay vanished forever. And still, something in the case refused to disappear completely. Maybe it was the distance, maybe it was the strangeness, maybe it was the sheer impossibility of the geography. A woman does not simply leave Alabama and end up dead in California without a story powerful enough to survive underneath the silence. Even when the case was cold, even when the name was gone, the shape of it remained wrong enough to keep haunting the file. There had to be a reason she was there. There had to be a path between those 2 points. And somewhere inside that path was another person, maybe several. Someone who knew how she got west. Someone who knew why she never came back. Someone who benefited every year that Victoria stayed divided between a missing person report in one state and a nameless body in another. The breakthrough did not come from memory, it came from science. That is how cases like Victoria's returned to life after decades of silence. In 2025, the Riverside County Regional Cold Case Team used investigative genetic genealogy to identify the Jane Doe found in 1980 as Victoria Hicks Hargrove of Opelika, Alabama. After more than 40 years, the missing woman in Alabama and the unidentified body in California were finally proven to be the same person. That kind of identification changes everything, because once a Jane Doe gets her name back, the case stops being about who she was and starts becoming about what happened to her. The file is no longer centered on description, clothing, measurements, and autopsy uncertainty. It shifts toward life, relationships, travel, work, timeline, motive, opportunity. Suddenly, investigators are not just looking at a dead woman in a ravine. They are looking at Victoria, a 29-year-old Alabama woman with a job, an apartment, a social circle, and a disappearance that now has to be understood as part of a larger sequence. And that is where the case becomes even more disturbing. Because naming her did not make the story simpler, it made it stranger. Now, the impossible geography was official. Victoria had vanished in Alabama in late January 1980, and within weeks her body was found in Southern California. Authorities said the identification raised a major unresolved question. How did she end up more than 2,000 miles from home? That question now sits at the center of the case, because it is no longer theoretical. It is the confirmed shape of her final known journey. Once you know that, the whole case changes temperature. A local disappearance can still leave room for accident, drift, or private tragedy. A cross-country death does not. A woman from Opelika does not just appear dead in Riverside County without another person or persons changing the direction of her life. Maybe she traveled willingly at first. Maybe she trusted someone. Maybe she was lured. Maybe she thought she was starting something new, fixing something old, or just leaving town for reasons that made sense to her at the time. But whatever the first step looked like, The end point forces one truth into focus. Someone, somewhere, had control over the story long enough for her to die, far from the people who knew her. That is what modern investigators are now facing. Not just a cold case, a movement case, a transport case, a case where the distance itself may be one of the biggest clues. Because distance creates questions ordinary murder cases do not have to answer. Who saw her along the way? Did she travel by car, with someone she knew? Did she cross multiple states with another person? Was California always the destination, or just the place where she was abandoned? Did the journey begin as consensual travel and turn violent later, or was the movement itself part of the crime from the beginning? These are not decorative questions, they are the structure of the case now. And then there is the Alabama side, which becomes far more important once her identity is restored. Victoria was not an isolated traveler floating free of context. She worked at local newspapers in Opelika and Auburn. She had routines, colleagues, and a life specific enough that investigators can now begin asking what changed in the days before she vanished. Who last saw her? What was her state of mind? Was she planning to leave? Did she mention travel? Was anyone pressuring her? Was there a man in her life? A conflict? A promise? A fear? Once her name came back, all of those ordinary human questions came back with it. That is why identification is not just emotional closure, it is investigative ignition. For 40 years, the case could not really burn because it did not know what fuel to use. Without Victoria's name, detectives could not properly reconstruct her final days in Alabama. Without that reconstruction, California was left staring at the body, while Alabama was left staring at the absence. Now the two halves finally meet, and when they meet, the case stops looking like a lonely Jane Doe file and starts looking like a probable homicide, with a missing transit story at its center. Authorities have publicly said investigators now suspect homicide, even though the exact cause of death was never conclusively determined in 1980. The strangest part may still be the overlap at the newspaper. Around the time Victoria vanished, an editor from the same paper also disappeared for a period before later returning. Officials have not publicly drawn a confirmed connection between the two disappearances, and investigators have said they cannot comment further. That does not prove a link. But it does keep the Alabama side of the story alive, as more than background, and it suggests that the world around Victoria before she vanished may hold more tension, more context, and more unanswered relationships than the public has yet been told. In the end, this case did not come back with the kind of answer people usually want. There was no arrest waiting at the end of the DNA match, no suspect led away in handcuffs after 40 years, no courtroom where Victoria's name could finally be spoken in the presence of the person responsible for taking her from Alabama and leaving her dead in California. What came back first was not justice, it was identity. And in a case like this, identity is both everything and not enough. Because once Victoria Hicks Hargrove got her name back, the world could finally see the full cruelty of what had happened to her. She was not just a Jane Doe discovered on a California roadside, she was a 29-year-old woman from Opelika, Alabama, with a real life, a real job, and a real disappearance that had been severed from her death for more than 4 decades. Investigators announced the identification in 2025, and authorities said the case was now being investigated as a likely homicide. That changed the emotional shape of the case immediately. Before the identification, the tragedy was separation. After the identification, the tragedy became intention. Because now the question is no longer, who was this woman? Now it is, what kind of person had the power to make this happen? What kind of person could move her 2,000 miles from home, leave her dead in a ravine, strip away her identity, and rely on the distance between Alabama and California to keep the story broken long enough that no one would put it back together? That is not the logic of accident. That is the logic of concealment. And concealment is its own kind of violence. For more than 40 years, Victoria's death did not just remain unsolved, it remained disassembled. The missing woman in Alabama and the dead woman in California were treated as separate realities because the system could not bridge the gap. If someone had meant for her to disappear deeply, not just physically but historically, the case almost fulfilled that plan. The country itself became part of the burial. State lines, old records, disconnected agencies, time. All of it worked in favor of whoever benefited from her staying nameless. That is why this case feels so haunting even now. Not because the victim is still unknown, because she is known at last, and yet the central human answer may still be out there. Who was with her? Why was she traveling? Did she go willingly at first? Was she running towards something, or from something, or simply trusting the wrong person? How does a woman leave Opelika and end up dead in the Coachella Valley in less than a month? Those questions are no longer abstract, they are now the real case. And in some ways, they are even more disturbing than the Jane Doe mystery ever was. Because anonymity created sorrow, identity creates suspicion. Once you know who she was, you start seeing how impossible the journey really is. And once you see that, someone else begins to emerge in the negative space of the story. Someone who knew more than they ever said. Someone who may have counted on her never getting her name back. That is what makes the identification so dangerous to the past. A nameless body can be filed away. A named woman can be traced. Her work can be traced. Her apartment can be traced. Her last known movements can be traced. Her relationships, tensions, co-workers, calls, routines, and fears can all be re-examined. Even the strange overlap involving the newspaper editor, who also disappeared around the same time, takes on a different emotional weight once Victoria is no longer anonymous, even though investigators have not publicly confirmed a connection. Identity does not solve a case by itself, but it narrows the darkness. It takes a body without context and forces the world to confront the context that should have mattered from the beginning. And that may be the closest thing this case has to justice for now. Not punishment, not yet, but restoration. Victoria is no longer trapped in a file as a Riverside Jane Doe. She is no longer separated from her own life. She is no longer just the body tourists happened to spot below a guardrail in 1980. She is Victoria Hicks Hargrove. And that name changes everything because it makes the case human again. It returns the death to the woman it happened to. It forces history to stop speaking about an unidentified body and start speaking about a person who was taken from one state and found in another. That matters more than people sometimes realize, because unidentified victims do not only lose justice, they lose narrative. The world cannot tell their story properly because it does not know who the story belongs to. Once the name comes back, the dead are no longer passive evidence. They begin pulling the case toward the life they actually lived. Victoria's Alabama life now matters as much as the California ravine where she was found, and that means whoever helped create the gap between those places may still have something to fear, if they are alive, and if they ever expected this case to stay buried. That is another one of the quiet horrors here. Whoever stood behind Victoria's death may have spent decades protected by nothing more sophisticated than time and distance. No need for a perfect cover-up, no need for a confession, no need for even a complete cause of death, just enough miles, enough silence, and enough bureaucratic separation to let the victim remain broken apart from herself. For 40 years that was enough. Then science caught up, and when science catches up, it does not always bring peace. Sometimes it brings exposure. That is where this story lands. Not with a solved murder, not yet. With a woman given back her name, with a death that now looks more clearly like homicide, with a cross-country mystery that has become sharper, not softer, after identification, and with one devastating fact that no longer can be ignored. Victoria Hicks Hargrove did not simply vanish. She was taken out of her life, carried beyond it, and left in a place where someone hoped she would never be fully returned. But she was, not in time, not in life, but in name. And sometimes, in cases this old, getting the name back is the moment the real investigation finally begins.